A family member, never easy, and people grieve in different ways, but most people do their grieving in private. They don't do it in public, but the Ford family are not most people. Since the passing of Betty Ford, as you said last Friday, there have been many steps and ceremonies to go through, and America has been watching through all of them. Today, the final day of what must be an incredibly taxing and emotional journey. The first of two funeral services was held Tuesday at St. Margaret's Church in Palm Desert, California. In attendance, some of the only people who know what it's like to be a First Lady, and Mrs. Ford was remembered as someone who didn't let politics get in the way of doing the right thing.
Someone who had the courage and grace to fight fear, stigma, and prejudice wherever she encountered.
Wednesday morning, her body was transported to Palm Springs International Airport, where an Air Force jet was waiting to bring Betty and her family home. They arrived in Grand Rapids early, where a respectful silence hung in the air. Governor Rick Snyder and invited guests greeted the family before a motorcade downtown. But before the procession could leave, a thank you from Steve Ford to the gathered crowd.
We're honoring Mom.
Shades of 4 years ago, as the journey traveled from Ford Airport down Ford Freeway to the Ford Museum, where a short ceremony was held.
Her husband provided the platform, but Lord, you gave her the voice and the courage to use it. You gave her the humility to speak of her own brokenness and call us all to healing.
Through the evening, West Michigan residents gathered to pay their respects to a woman who never forgot where she came from and raised her family with those same Midwestern values.
She was an awesome lady. She stood up and said she was an alcoholic before anybody else would have even thought about it. And she was a First Lady at the time, or a former First Lady. To me, that took some courage.
This morning, the final journey began as Mrs. Ford left the museum and traveled to Grace Episcopal, where dignitaries like President Clinton and Dick Cheney were in attendance. The service very similar to the first one held in California, yet no less emotional.
She was the one with the love and the comfort, and she was the first one there to put her arms around you.
Then Betty left the place where she married Jerry and went to join him beside the Grand River on what would have been his 98th birthday. One of the things we've all been talking about over the past few days, the grace, the poise by the family members,
yes.
The children, the grandchildren, the respect that they showed all the people who came out to pay their respects.
Yes.
That really stuck with me, as well as the fact that, you know, we said people grieve privately. This has to be really hard, and most times if you have a funeral, you want to do it, you want to get it over with so you can move on. But this has been, gosh, almost a week-long process now. It has to be so draining and taxing on the family. Not only did they lose their mom, but they've had to relive it and go through it over and over and over.
Taught well, though, certainly following in their parents' and grandparents' footsteps. And again, it was nice that they had the very last part, the very final several minutes were private. Yeah, just with the family.
The bagpipes, you know, impossible not to get a little misty-eyed when you saw that final scene.
And the circumstance, the pomp, everything that went with it. Really will stick with people who were there in person or watching it on TV or see the video, because it's something, as we said earlier, Grand Rapids will never see again.
That's right.
Lynn Carter, a good friend of the Fords, she will be speaking about politics. We are told politics in Washington when it wasn't so divided one versus another. You could be from a different party, but you could talk about being friends afterwards. And Cokie Roberts, as you said, comes from a political family, and the speeches that they're going to give were asked by Betty Ford. She said, I want you to speak about these things at my funeral.
And that's what Cokie has been saying, that she was very clear about what she wanted them to talk about.
The line of people was so long that went through the night when President Ford was there. Your feelings when that happened. Obviously, you were at that museum. You knew the people involved. Did you think, well, he's smiling down at this point, saying, wow, look at all this for me, and do you think it will be the same?
You know, Richard Norton Smith said in his eulogy that 62,000 people made sure that Gerald Ford wasn't lonely his last night in Grand Rapids.
So you guys were talking about the similarities between Betty Ford's funeral and Gerald Ford's funeral, and as we've learned, when you reach the office of the presidency, things like a funeral are planned well ahead of time. It has nothing to do with morbidity. It's just the logistics are so large that you have to get everything lined up, even if you are the picture of perfect health, and that is the case with both President Ford and Betty Ford. Both had their services, their initial ones in their adopted home in the Palm Springs area before heading back to the final resting place of Grand Rapids. As you remember, this was the scene yesterday at the first funeral in Palm Desert at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church that the President and the First Lady attended. It was invitation only. As you see, guests included former President George W. Bush, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Nancy Reagan, and First Lady Michelle Obama. Former First Lady Rosalind Carter spoke, as did Cokie Roberts, a Ford family friend and somebody who understood the politics as well as the relationships in Washington. Then after the funeral, Mrs. Ford's body rested in repose for a public viewing in the Palm Springs area until midnight Pacific time. That would be 3 a.m. here in West Michigan. Then this morning around 9 a.m. Pacific time, that is noon in Michigan, after a private ceremony at St. Margaret's, Mrs. Ford was escorted by California Highway Patrol cars to Palm Springs International Airport. You were talking about the time that it will take to get from the airport to the Ford Museum. Well, this was supposed to be about a 15-minute drive, but with thousands of onlookers paying their respects, it took them about 30 minutes for the journey. Some saluted, others put their hands over their hearts or held signs thanking Mrs. Ford. Then that Air Force C-32, a 757 basically, from the presidential fleet was waiting on the tarmac. The family members boarded in the back as Betty Ford's casket was placed in the front of the aircraft. Then they taxied and took off at about 1:15 Eastern time. That was slightly behind schedule, but it did get the plane to Ford International Airport on time, as we just saw. You were talking about people who didn't know her, the emotions, seeing people waving those flags. It really makes you feel what West Michigan is about, because people who weren't born when Jerry Ford was in office, who knew nothing about Betty Ford, probably some of them until this week, are out there because she's one of their own. And I was there standing along 96 and the Beltline near the Calvary Church. That was my place where I went to watch as President Ford made his final trip downtown. And Christian, you were saying they were 3, 4, 5 deep. There were cars parked all along the Beltline, people who really got 30 seconds of viewing time, but it still made you feel connected to the whole situation that December a few years ago.